The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's General hummed a monotonous, sterile tune. It was a sound Clara Thorne had come to associate with invisibility. At 3:47 a.m., in the graveyard shift's deepest trench, the hum was the only thing that acknowledged her existence. It was a constant, indifferent companion as she pushed the gray mop bucket, its sloshing water and the faint scent of bleach, the only evidence of her passage through the gleaming, empty corridors of the surgical wing. Her hands, wrapped around the cold metal handle of the mop, trembled slightly. It was a constant tremor, a ghost of old traumas that lived in her nerve endings. Most people, if they bothered to notice her at all, saw the tremor and the premature silver in her dark hair and assumed frailty. They saw the slight, almost imperceptible limp in her right leg and assumed age. They saw the oversized, faded blue janitorial uniform and saw a woman who had reached the end of her road. They saw Clara, the quiet, middle-aged cleaning lady, and saw nothing at all. That was the point. Anonymity was a fortress. Silence was a shield. The sharp, arrogant click of expensive Italian leather shoes on the polished linoleum announced his arrival long before he turned the corner. Dr. Preston Hayes, chief of cardiac surgery, moved through the hospital not as an employee, but as a monarch inspecting his domain. He was flanked by his usual sycophants, Dr. Jessica Vance, a third-year resident whose ambition was eclipsed only by her cruelty, and Greg, a surgical intern who mimicked Hayes's every sneer. They didn't alter their path. They walked straight through the section of floor she had just mopped, leaving a trail of smudged footprints on the still damp surface. Clara flinched but said nothing, pressing herself back against the wall to become even smaller. Hayes stopped, turning to look at her as if noticing a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture for the first time. "Clara, isn't it?" His voice was smooth, cultured, and dripped with a condescension so profound it was almost an art form. "We've spoken about this. Your duties should not impede the actual work that happens in this hospital. This floor is a thoroughfare, not your personal canvas." "I'm sorry, Doctor," Clara whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll be done in a moment." Jessica Vance let out a small, sharp laugh. "She's always done in a moment. I think her moments are measured on a geological timescale." Hayes smiled, a predator's flash of white teeth. He gestured vaguely at her bucket. "This is a sterile environment. The fumes from that chemical slop you use are probably toxic. And you," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers with a look of pure disgust, "are a contamination risk. Try to be less present." With a final smirk, he continued down the hall, his entourage trailing in his wake like pilot fish. Clara waited until the sound of their footsteps faded. Her trembling hands tightened on the mop handle, her knuckles white. She took a slow, measured breath, a technique she'd learned long ago to control things far worse than a racing heart. In through the nose for 4, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8, box breathing, a simple tool to cage the beast. She looked at the smudged footprints desecrating her clean floor. With a sigh that carried the weight of years, she dipped the mop back into the bucket and began to erase them, erasing herself along with them. This was her life now. A quiet penance, a place to be forgotten. She'd chosen it. She just hadn't anticipated how much it would cost her soul, piece by piece, night after night. 2 hours later, the humiliations continued, as they always did. A coffee spill in the doctor's lounge. Dr. Hayes, holding court with a group of exhausted residents, saw her enter with her cart. The cleanup crew has arrived. Perfect timing." He deliberately nudged his half-full cup with his elbow, sending hot coffee splashing across the floor. "Whoops. Clumsy me. See to that, Clara, and be quick about it. The sight of you on your knees is rather pathetic." The residents chuckled, some uncomfortably, others with genuine malice. Clara said nothing. She knelt, the familiar ache in her right knee flaring up, and began to wipe up the spill with practiced, economical movements. As she worked, she heard Hayes pontificating about a complex aortic valve replacement he'd performed. He was using the wrong terminology for a new type of composite graft. A small, instinctive correction formed in her mind. It's a tri-leaflet bovine pericardial valve, not a porcine graft. The hemodynamic profile is completely different, but she crushed the thought before it could reach her lips. That part of her was dead, buried. It had to be. A young nurse named Ben, who sometimes left a sealed granola bar on her cart when no one was looking, caught her eye as she was leaving. He offered a small, apologetic smile. It was the only kindness she'd received all night. She gave him a tiny nod in return, a flicker of gratitude in a sea of degradation. It was enough. The first sign that the night was about to break from its grim routine came not from a PA system, but from the televisions in the main waiting area. Clara was emptying the trash cans when she saw the breaking news crawl. Motorcade attacked in downtown financial district. Multiple casualties. High-level official reportedly among the injured. Clara froze. Her eyes scanned the chaotic footage. The black armored SUVs riddled with bullet holes. The smoke. The flashing lights. Her mind, the part she tried to keep dormant, began to work. It analyzed the attack pattern, the vehicle formation, the likely egress routes. It was a professional hit, an ambush. Her body went cold, the tremor in her hands worsened, and she shoved them deep into the pockets of her oversized uniform. The smell of antiseptic in the air was suddenly replaced by the phantom scent of cordite and hot metal. Minutes later, the hospital's internal alert system blared to life. Code Black, external disaster, all staff to battle stations. I repeat, Code Black. The quiet hum of the hospital was shattered. Doors flew open. Doctors and nurses ran through the halls, their faces grim. The carefully maintained order of the night shift dissolved into controlled chaos. Clara, by reflex, began to move, not toward an exit, but toward the emergency department. Her limp seemed to vanish, her stride becoming purposeful. She wasn't a janitor anymore. She was moving to the sound of the guns. The ER entrance exploded in a flurry of activity. A convoy of black SUVs and police cruisers screeched to a halt. Men in dark suits with earpieces and rifles formed a perimeter, their faces stone cold, their eyes constantly scanning. They were Secret Service, and they were terrified. Paramedics burst through the doors with a gurney. On it, a man in a torn, blood-soaked suit lay pale and still. IV lines snaked from his arms, and a paramedic was manually bagging him. Clara saw the 4 stars on the collar of the uniform, visible beneath the suit jacket. A general. A very important one. Doctor. Hayes, drawn by the commotion and the irresistible pull of a high-profile case, stormed into the trauma bay. "I'm in charge here," he bellowed, puffing out his chest. "Get him into Trauma 1. I want vitals, a full workup, and someone get me his pressure now." The team swarmed the gurney. The patient was General James Matthews, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He'd taken multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, as well as shrapnel from the explosion that had disabled his vehicle. His pressure was crashing, his heart rate was erratic. Clara stood in the doorway, half hidden behind a supply cart. She had been tasked with keeping the area clear, a role she now ignored completely. Her janitor's uniform made her invisible, a ghost at the edge of the storm. And from that vantage point, she could see everything. She wasn't just seeing a patient, she was reading a battlefield. Hayes was loud and commanding, but his orders were scattered. "Get me O-neg, push 2 of EPI. Let's get him intubated. Where's the damn ultrasound?" He was throwing the textbook at the patient, but he wasn't reading the signs. The general's neck veins were distended, his breath sounds were absent on the right side, and he had severe tracheal deviation, though it was hard to see amidst the chaos and swelling. "He's going into PEA," a nurse shouted. Pulseless electrical activity. The heart had an electrical signal, but it wasn't pumping. A death sentence. Clara's mind screamed the diagnosis: tension, pneumothorax. Air was filling his chest cavity from a punctured lung, crushing his heart and great vessels. Every breath the paramedic forced into him was making it worse. It was a simple diagnosis for a combat medic, one you learn to spot in the dark, under fire, with your hands covered in blood. But in this sterile, brightly lit room, surrounded by millions of dollars of equipment, the great Dr. Hayes was missing it. He was focused on the bleeding in the abdomen, on the cardiac rhythm. He couldn't see the simple mechanical problem that was killing the most powerful military officer in the country. "Charge the paddles to 200, Hayes ordered, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. "We're shocking him." That was it, the final, fatal mistake. You don't shock PEA. It does nothing. It was a Hail Mary from a doctor who was in over his head and couldn't admit it. The part of Clara that had been dormant for 5 years broke free of its cage. The quiet, timid janitor died in that instant. Stop. The voice was not a whisper. It was a low, resonant command that cut through the noise of the trauma bay like a surgeon's scalpel. Every head turned. They saw Clara standing just inside the room, her mop and bucket forgotten. Her posture had changed. She was no longer stooped. She stood straight, her shoulders back, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the air crackle. Hayes stared at her, his face a mask of incandescent rage. "What did you say? Get out! Security! Remove her!" Two hospital security guards, burly men used to dealing with drunks and distraught family members, moved toward her. "Ma'am, you need to leave." Clara didn't even look at them. Her eyes were locked on the monitor, on the dying man. "You're going to kill him," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion except absolute certainty. "He has a tension pneumothorax. You shock him, and you're just cooking a dead man. Stop compressions." "This is insane," Jessica Vance shrieked. "She's a cleaner." The first guard reached for Clara's arm. What happened next was too fast for most to follow. Clara shifted her weight. Her left hand came up, redirecting the guard's arm. Her right foot swept his legs out from under him. He went down with a surprised grunt. The second guard lunged. Clara sidestepped, using his own momentum to guide him into a supply rack, which crashed over with a deafening clatter of metal and plastic. It was a display of effortless, brutal efficiency. In the stunned silence that followed, Clara moved. She strode to a nearby cart, her limp completely gone. Her hand, no longer trembling, darted out and snatched a 14-gauge angiocath and 2 alcohol swabs. She was at the general's bedside before Hayes could even process what had happened. "Don't you touch him!" Hayes roared, finally moving to intercept her. Clara looked up at him. For the first time, he saw her eyes. They weren't the downcast, timid eyes of a janitor. They were chips of glacial ice, ancient and hard, and utterly devoid of fear. "Get out of my way, doctor," she said, her voice a low growl, "or I will put you on the floor and you will not get up." There was something in her voice, a promise of such swift and total violence, that the world-renowned surgeon, the king of this castle, took an involuntary step back. Clara turned her attention back to the patient. Her movements were a blur of economy and precision. Swabbed the chest, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right over the third rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. The knowledge was as much a part of her as the blood in her veins. She held the large-bore needle, uncapped it, and with a steady hand, plunged it deep into the general's chest. There was an immediate audible hiss, the sound of trapped high-pressure air escaping the pleural cavity. On the monitor, the change was instantaneous and miraculous. The narrow, chaotic PEA rhythm widened into a viable sinus tachycardia. The blood pressure, which had been non-existent, shot up to 80/50. The oxygen saturation climbed from 70 to 92%. The general's heart was beating again. He was alive. The entire room was frozen in a state of collective shock. Nurses stared, mouths agape. Residents looked from the monitor to the cleaning lady and back again. Dr. Hayes's face was a mottled canvas of fury, humiliation, and disbelief. And then, a new sound began to intrude. A deep, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that grew rapidly in volume. It wasn't the familiar sound of a single medical helicopter landing on the rooftop helipad. This was different. It was lower, heavier, and there was more than one. The windows of the trauma bay began to vibrate. The instruments on the metal trays rattled. The sound grew into a deafening, building-shaking roar. Ben, the young nurse, ran to the window and looked out into the pre-dawn sky. His face went pale. "Oh my God," he breathed. "Helicopters, big ones, they're everywhere." They weren't just helicopters, they were MH-47G Chinooks and MH-60M Black Hawks, the matte black, specially modified beasts of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment. They weren't landing. They were hovering, surrounding the hospital's upper floors like colossal, angry wasps. Dark ropes snaked down from their open doors. Figures in black tactical gear began to descend. Simultaneously, the main doors of the ER burst open. A dozen men clad in black armor and carrying suppressed M4 carbines swarmed into the department. They moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, clearing corners, securing intersections, their discipline absolute. They weren't police, they weren't SWAT. Their patches were sterile, their gear was top of the line. They were Tier 1 operators. Their team leader, a man with the build of a grizzly bear and a face carved from granite, strode into the trauma bay. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept the room in a fraction of a second. He saw the Secret Service agents, the hospital staff, Dr. Hayes, the patient on the table, and finally, he saw Clara. His professional mask shattered, his eyes widened in disbelief, then flooded with a wave of raw, unfiltered reverence. He stopped dead in his tracks and snapped to a perfect position of attention, his rifle held tight against his chest. "Angel 6, he barked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Ma'am, my God, we came as soon as we heard." Behind him, every single one of the deadly soldiers, seeing their leader's reaction, followed suit. One by one, they snapped to attention, their weapons pointing safely at the floor, their bodies ramrod straight. A dozen elite special operators, the most dangerous men on the planet, were standing at attention, saluting the hospital janitor. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the steady beeping of the cardiac monitor and the roar of the helicopters outside. Dr. Hayes finally found his voice, sputtering with rage and confusion. "What's the meaning of this? Who are you people? And who in God's name is she?" The team leader, a master sergeant with hash marks up his sleeve and a 1,000-yard stare, slowly turned his head. He fixed Hayes with a look of such concentrated contempt that the surgeon physically recoiled. The master sergeant didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were colder and sharper than any scalpel Hayes had ever held. "You're addressing Lieutenant Colonel Clara Thorne, retired United States Army," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Call sign Angel 6, former flight surgeon for a unit you've never heard of, attached to a task force you're not cleared to know about." He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, diminishing Hayes to a cowering wreck. "This woman," he said, gesturing with his chin toward Clara, "is a legend. She holds a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 5 Bronze Stars with Valor. She pioneered the use of whole blood transfusions on the battlefield. The procedure you just saw her perform, she perfected it in the back of a crashing helicopter over the Hindu Kush, using the antenna as a guide wire. The man on that table, General Matthews, is alive because of her. Not you." The Master Sergeant's eyes narrowed. "I was in a building that collapsed on top of my team in Kandahar. We were trapped for 53 hours. She was the medic on the ground. She crawled into the rubble with rebar sticking out of her own leg and kept 6 of us alive with nothing but a Leatherman and 2 tourniquets. She amputated my sergeant's arm with a K-bar knife to free him from the wreckage. She wrote the book on prolonged field care that every medic in SOCOM is required to memorize. A book I'm willing to bet is sitting on a shelf in your fancy office." He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow against Hayes's monumental ego. "We heard General Matthews was down," the Master Sergeant continued, his voice dropping even lower. "We spun up a rescue package, but we also heard a transmission on the Secret Service net. Something about an unidentified woman, a hospital janitor, saving his life. There's only one person on this planet who fits that description." He turned his gaze back to Clara, his expression softening into one of fierce loyalty and profound respect. "We didn't come for the general, ma'am. We came for you." On the gurney, General Matthews's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was hazy, but it found Clara, a flicker of recognition. "Clara," he rasped, his voice weak, "knew you couldn't stay away." A faint smile touched his lips. "Always saving my ass." Clara finally moved. She walked over to the general and gently checked his pulse at the carotid artery. Her hands were rock steady. "Rest, sir," she said softly. "You're stable for now. We'll get you out of here." "Angel 6 has the scene," the Master Sergeant reported into his comms unit. "Package is secure and stabilized, preparing for immediate evac." A military medic, carrying a pack filled with equipment that made the hospital's gear look like children's toys, brushed past the paralyzed Dr. Hayes and began working on the general under Clara's quiet direction. Hayes was irrelevant now, a ghost in his own operating theater. He stood there, his face ashen, his world completely and irrevocably shattered. The power he had wielded with such casual cruelty had evaporated. In front of him stood a woman who had operated in a crucible he couldn't even imagine, a woman revered as a savior by men who ate surgeons like him for breakfast. Jessica Vance looked like she was going to be sick. Ben, the young nurse, simply stared at Clara, his face a portrait of pure, unadulterated awe. He finally understood the quiet dignity, the coiled strength he had always sensed beneath her timid exterior. Clara looked down at her hands, covered in a light sheen of the general's blood. They weren't a janitor's hands anymore. They were a surgeon's, a soldier's. She had tried to bury that person, to let her die in the quiet, anonymous halls of St. Jude's. But she'd been wrong. People like her didn't get to retire. They just waited to be called. The master sergeant, whose name she remembered was Deckard, came to her side. "It's time to go home, ma'am." Home. The word felt foreign. For 5 years, this hospital, this life of quiet servitude, had been her shelter from the storm of her past. But the storm had found her. She looked around the trauma bay, at the faces of the people who had mocked her, dismissed her, and underestimated her. She felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. She gave a single, decisive nod. "Let's go, Sergeant." As she walked toward the exit, flanked by Deckard and his team, the hospital staff parted before her like the Red Sea. They stared in silence, their previous insults and jokes echoing in their minds, now tasting like ash. Dr. Hayes remained frozen, a statue of his own broken pride. As she passed him, Clara paused for a fraction of a second. She didn't look at him, she just spoke, her voice once again quiet, but now laced with the strength of forged steel. "Know your place, Doctor." Then she was gone. She walked out into the cool night air, the thunder of the helicopter rotors washing over her. A Black Hawk had landed in the ambulance bay, its blades churning the air into a maelstrom. Deckard helped her aboard. As the helicopter lifted off, banking sharply over the city, Clara looked down at the hospital shrinking below. A brightly lit box full of pain and healing, arrogance and humility. She had come here seeking peace, a quiet place to heal the wounds no one could see. She had tried to become invisible, to scrub away the blood and the memories with bleach and water, but all she had done was trade one battlefield for another. And the one thing she had learned, the one truth that had followed her from the mountains of Afghanistan to the sterile corridors of St. Jude's, was that you can't escape who you are. The tremor in her hands had returned, a familiar ghost settling back into her bones. But this time, she didn't hide it. She looked at her trembling hands in the green glow of the helicopter's cockpit, and for the first time in 5 years, she accepted them. They were the hands of a healer. They were the hands of a warrior. They were the hands of Angel 6. And she was finally going home.